you look at the landscape, if you may, of the map, global map, and you try to plot there the mega FTAs that are now ongoing. So you have TTIP between EU and the US. You have TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that is being negotiated by, if I'm not mistaken, 12 countries, which is led by the United States. You have in the ASEAN region and the Greater Asia region, you have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. That is, this one is called RCEP, and this is many view this as China's response, really, to TPP and TTIP. And then there's a new proposal for a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So if you look at it, if you look at the landscape, and the major players that are involved in these mega FTAs, you see that there's really a geopolitical agenda, and economic agenda underlying these negotiations, and that is really to define who gets to set the rules for the conduct of international trade and investments.
It's simply untrue. In fact, it's a lie that world trade rules do not affect the right of governments to regulate in the interest of public health and food safety and hygiene. The EU repeats this mantra. The treaties we enter into will have no impact on food safety. It's nonsense. It is utter and total nonsense. Europe has experienced mass unemployment and increasing inequality. And now the European Commission is pushing a trade deal as an answer to Europe's woes. And ask yourself, is the current situation in Europe the result of insufficient protection for transnational investors? Is there mass unemployment because public services have not been opened up more widely to transnational investors? Are we suffering from a lack of investor rights? And I think the answer is no. So the treaty is really about something else.
These are new generation FTAs that are pushing for a common agenda, and that these agreements are really tools by which the economic superpowers, if you may, or are advance their economic agenda in the region.
These agreements are not really about free trade. They are about protecting the investments, and at the cost of transparent democratic processes and environmental and social concerns.
There are a lot of development impacts which European FTAs are creating on developing countries in general. You know, they have signed agreements with ASEAN countries, across the globe, EU has free trade agreements with developing countries, and they push for certain provisions which have some harmful impacts on the developing countries.
Trade and investment agreements, the regionals and the bilaterals, have been used to knock down government restrictions or bans on the production, transport, and waste management of toxic chemicals. They've been used to attack licensing and management of land and water resources, to attack government policies promoting clean energy, to attack laws and regulations eliminating toxic pesticides, which poison workers, leave harmful residues, and are bad for the environment. And they've been used to attack labeling laws. All of these have a direct impact on public and on worker and consumer health and safety. So again, it is nonsense when the European Commission says none of this will affect our food safety. It's simply untrue. It's just the record is very different. It dozens of European funds are now using bilateral trade and investment agreements to demand full payment on sovereign debt issued by the countries of Greece, by the governments of Greece and Cyprus. And those restructurings were actually brokered by the IMF. So they're being challenged under free trade agreements. If they succeed, Greece and Cyprus will be forced, because they'll have to pay enormous sums of money, they will have less revenue to spend on health, and of course these lawsuits will have a direct impact on health and safety.
Like so, you have been discussing the ISDS provision, which will be a major part of the TTIP, and it will have implications, and it will have implications for Europe. And Europe has actually been asking for these provisions in their agreements with developing countries. Now, now when you're negotiating with the US, you're worried about it. You can see what impact it will create in EU. But EU has actually done the same thing to developing countries. And what it does is it provides very strong rights to European investors.
India, we have a unique agriculture situation where still the highest employment provider in the country is agriculture. So most of our farmers are small and marginal. And at the same time, they're also net consumers of food. So they're not even producing enough for themselves. So we need a whole public system which is able to give farmers the right prices, and at the same time food is available for cheap. So there is a big role for the state in agriculture in India, and with these, and for the state to protect both livelihoods and to keep prices low of the majority of farmers. Each of these free trade agreements, we find, firstly, they're very intransparent the way they're negotiated and dealt with. So we really don't know the details and how it happens till it actually happens. But each of these, basically, we find them as being a threat to the livelihood of Indian farmers. It limits what the government can do to support farmers.
And interestingly, now in India, there's a change because the big industry associations are realizing they are not gaining anything from the FTAs. We said, hey, we've been saying this for years, that you're not going to gain from this FTAs. But anyway, late realization, but still they have realized, and they are telling the government, review your FTAs first. See whether we have gained, we have not gained, and only then you sign more agreements. Because we are, on the brink of a very different kinds of agreements. Now we have begun to negotiate and sign with developed countries. Earlier, India's agreements were mainly with other developing country partners. They would not ask for certain, very strong provisions in many areas. But now we are negotiating with the EU, we are negotiating with EFTA, with Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So now is the time to make certain decisions. And thankfully, industry associations, etc., have also been asking for a review. And it's a very essential way of ensuring food security in developing countries. And so agricultural livelihoods, it's very important. It's not that they could all move out and buy the food, because agriculture really plays that role that automatically they are not able to sell everything and their hunger will be met at home. And so therefore, I'm making the argument that especially for large countries like India, with a large hungry population, 67% of the population is hungry, food self-sufficiency is very important. We've seen in times of the food crisis how big countries then have it difficult if they are reliant on the import markets to actually supply that food which their people needs. So many countries cannot produce food. So they have to import. But our countries and most developing countries can produce food. And so it's very important for them to continue to have production. And ours is small farmer-led production. So there's under no circumstances, if we want to ensure food security and the right to food, can we threaten farmers' ability to produce.
The World Trade and Investment regime has been a disaster. Particularly for rural livelihoods in developing countries. The EU continues to fund the massive destruction of agriculture and with it the right to food, which is a fundamental human right, and that is something which we should not tolerate. In Europe, these standards are still based on the precautionary principle, while in the US, the burden of proof is on the government to demonstrate potential harm from commercial products. These two opposed doctrines, which are now being proposed as candidates for mutual recognition, have very striking results. In the US, every year, 48 million people, that's 1 out of every 6 persons, are sickened from eating contaminated food, and some 3,000 people die from eating poisoned food. In Europe, with 2.5 times the population, the last figures I have, in 2011, an estimated 70,000 people were sickened by contaminated food, and there were 93 deaths. So that's what these different safety regimes give you, very different outcomes. And Japan has even stricter safety standards, but they're, of course, under pressure to lower theirs to the TPPA and through the bilaterals. So TTIP and TPPA put these higher standards at risk. There's no question about it. Contrary to the industry claims, the expansion of GM crops has led to increased global pesticide use, which is not surprising if you consider that most of these crops have been specifically modified for pesticide and herbicide tolerance. They can take large quantities of it. 3 million people annually are poisoned by agrochemicals. 30,000 people die around the world, including in the European Union and North America, of pesticide exposure and poisoning. The residues that harm consumers, the ones that consumers are upset about, are just that. They're residues, but agricultural workers, our members, face direct exposure in the fields, and they pay a very heavy price in terms of their health and their lives. And of course, there are the wider social costs of soil and water pollution. So under pressure from investment agreements, food safety standards are being harmonized downwards. The one chapter that I'm aware of that's been leaked on the TTIP concerns so-called regulatory coherence, and what the European Union in that text, that's the EU text, proposes is the mutual recognition of existing standards, which is a recipe for mutual destruction on both sides. And of course that would be backed up by an investor-to-state dispute resolution procedure. So this is regulatory convergence around the lowest common denominator. Corporate lobbies in the US, with the open or covert support of their European counterparts, want to overturn all restrictions on GM food production and associated labeling. And US industry has taken special aim at proposed new European Union standards on food containing residues of pesticides belonging to the class of endocrine disruptors. That is, those chemicals that disrupt the endocrine system with big implications for growth and health. So the so-called free trade promoted by the WTO and by the regional and bilateral free trade agreements, as they are called, has concentrated essentially on rolling back what are called non-tariff barriers to trade in goods and services. And these non-tariff barriers are laws and regulations adopted by governments in the public interest and the government provision of public services. So where we, for example, as a trade union, see the result of successful struggles to defend worker health and safety, or consumer interests, or to protect the environment through laws and regulations, the WTO sees barriers which have to be rolled back and knocked down. And that is why, as some of the previous speakers have emphasized, so-called free trade agreements are essentially about investment, privatization, and deregulation. They have little to do with trade in the way that most people would think about it.
When EU was negotiating agreements with developing countries, it has a very aggressive stance. It wants a lot of things, actually. Our negotiators say that EU negotiators want the moon. You know, they want everything. They're very demanding. But you'll see that the same similar provisions or other provisions, but perpetuating that same framework of the powerful exploiting the weak, comes back to haunt them when, say, they are negotiating with the US. And how does EU ask? It doesn't ask only India, it's asking all developing country partners for access to the agricultural market when you cannot negotiate European subsidies. And so that's asymmetric. And how does it then, what impact does it have for our ability to keep producing food, and that's the only way we can meet right to food, provide access to food, and that's becoming a very increasing challenge for us, and we are very worried about this FTA. EU is really putting pressure on India to cover almost 97% of the goods, which means agriculture plus industrial products. So if you have only 3% which you can keep out of the purview of the FTAs, you cannot really protect your agriculture sector. And everybody thinks EU only wants just highly processed food products and access only to those markets. But we've seen internal documents. They want wines and spirits is a big issue which EU wants to sell to India. But cereals, dairy products, processed food, poultry, they have a long list on agriculture. And for EU, it's a very critical area. They really want access to India's agriculture market. Now, India has signed many free trade agreements with other developing countries mostly. EU will be, it is not signed yet, negotiations are still going on, but it can conclude like any time, and we are very worried. They also want India to ratify certain global seed conventions, which gives a lot of protection to companies producing seeds, and that really threatens farmers' access. Once the farmers have bought those seeds, they are not free to exchange it, keep it for next year, give it to their cousin, who will produce. And that's how we do our cultivation. Traditionally, that's how we have produced food. But there are a whole lot of restrictions that it will bring on the use of seeds if India had to sign it under this FTA. So as we stand now, we can't sell to EU. So EU standards act as a natural barrier. And we can't ask Europe, of course, why should they lower their food standards? It's about food and health and food safety, which Peter will discuss after this. And they are also facing threats. But in effect, it blocks our farmers out. Indian products come and land in EU and they lie at the ports because they will not be allowed to enter the country. And they rot. Those products cannot go back. It's a complete wastage of farmers' products. And the FTA is not going to address this as well. So we lose our protection while EU keeps its all protections. And this is just the way, different ways that EU gives subsidies. Even at the WTO, it's bypassing its commitments for subsidy cuts, and this is really coming to haunt us. This is really mattering.
If these rules and standards are set by the developed countries, it is often difficult for developing countries. Well, developing countries would have no choice but to comply with these rules. And more often than not, developing countries are in a disadvantage, both in terms of the capacity to implement some of these rules, as well as the financial capability, because moving from one set of rules to a higher, quote-unquote, standard would require financial resources as well. So what is at stake is really the capacity of government, particularly in developing countries in Asia, to adjust their economic priorities to comply with the rules that are not set based on their own development interests, but actually the agenda is set elsewhere, and this is the agenda set by the economic superpowers. So even before they actually engage in the negotiations, the more contentious aspects of the talks are already being ironed out not through the negotiations themselves, but through the back door, by changing the national laws that are anticipated to become deterrents of sorts to the negotiations, because it gives more premium on the rights of corporations to earn their profits over the rights of the people and the ability of government to use policy to support the public interest.
Like I said, with these FTAs, we find it also very difficult because it does not get discussed in our parliament. It's only people who are specialists and work on this, like say Ranja, who have to give us the, help us understand what is happening. But otherwise, it's not transparent and it doesn't come out till actually the effect is seen. That is the biggest problem with the FTAs, because the FTAs the government does not have to go through parliament to sign the FTAs. And therefore, we don't even know, it's not negotiated through the parliament, and it's usually come to the light to the public and to the parliament only after the government has made the negotiation and has signed the deals. But if it becomes a big issue, for example, the WTO public stockholding became a big issue publicly, then the parliamentarians raise questions in parliament, then it becomes a debate, which puts pressure on the government to take a stand while the negotiations are going on. But with these bilateral FTAs, we find that it does not, many times comes out much later, much after the discussions are over, sometimes even after the agreement is made, the details. So it also needs a very vigilant civil society, which is bringing it to the notice of parliament even before it's over. That's one way of bringing it into discussion in the parliament.
Because, all FTA negotiations are secret, the documents are secret, but we just have to rely on leaked text, etc. But we at least have seen some impact assessment studies, and what it says for agriculture is not good. And you are lucky that the European Parliament has to ratify. Our Parliament does not have to. Our parliamentarians don't have a clue. And our state governments, because agriculture, health, these are state subjects or they are joint subjects. Health is a joint subject. But the central government is negotiating, signing a lot of these agreements, which will have huge impact on agriculture and health. They don't have to consult the state governments. They don't have to talk to the parliament. So the government Kerala is a state in the south. So the Kerala government asked the central government before the signing that, can you share the document? Can you share? We need to read it, and we don't want it. It will affect our farmers badly, and we want to get it. So the Prime Minister said, yeah, we are just faxing it to you. Fax never came. They signed the agreement in the meantime.
I think also that these developments in Asia and in a way that changing views of governments are also triggered by what is happening outside the region. For example, in Ecuador, there is also a citizens audit of bilateral investment treaties. There's also some critical positions being raised in South Africa. In the US, recently I read some reports that even some senators, Democratic senators, have expressed some critical views on ISDS.
There's been kind of public outrage and mobilization, but when it comes to these FTAs, like I was saying, so they're so intransparent that it is also difficult to mobilize public opinion because people don't understand. Even those of us who've been working on these issues, it's when things start affecting people that then we protest. So it's very difficult to speculate saying if we sign this is what will happen and therefore we have to protest, when one is not able to look at the immediate impact it has. On the WTO, we managed to have some immediate response because it came at a time when the National Food Security was just passed, Food Security Act, which itself was a result of a lot of civil society mobilization. And then it came at a time where then one could clearly see the link that if that happened, then the act would not be implemented. And therefore, there was a lot of mobilization immediately. So I think there has to be this, a multilateral situation is better than these bilaterals because there is some collective bargaining power and there can be no trade agreement which is otherwise equal. I mean, the North will always want to make an agreement where it benefits. And therefore we need somewhere where there is a better level playing field, and I think that will come when the South is together and there's some South-South cooperation. And within the country, I think we need to demand to ensure that in all these FTAs go through Parliament and through public debate and consultation within the country before the government can take any position.
But a positive development we can also point out is that there are states, for example, Indonesia, that are slowly seeing the necessity of balancing the interest, the corporate interest and the national interest or the people's interest. And they are now undergoing, for example, a process of review of investment policies in Indonesia and in review of bilateral investment treaties. In fact, very recently, last year, the Indonesian government terminated one of its bilateral investment treaties with the Netherlands, and prompting a process of a more thorough review of its not just its existing bids, but its investment policy in general.
So I just wanted to give you a flavor of in India. There's been growing opposition to the FTA. A lot of it in the fields of medicine, intellectual property rights, and that it will increase, medicine costs, and which the investment chapter is also going to affect, etc. So civil society groups and farmers groups have really written letters and tried to talk to the government, expressing their opposition.
So the question raised by one of the speakers, what can be done? I think it's very important that countries, including Indonesia and South Africa, which have many free trade and investment agreements, bilaterals, are letting these agreements lapse because they see the threat. They will not negotiate any new ones. Australia has said, particularly striking in view of the two tobacco lawsuits, it will sign no new treaties containing investor estate. So it is possible to simply not to sign. And I think, again, when we ask what is to be done, don't sign any new agreements. Stop TTIP, stop TPPA, stop TISA, and then begin by rolling back the most toxic provisions of the other treaties.
The way that we are trying to address these mega agreements is really to resist it at multiple fronts. So we strengthen and consolidate national platforms to resist and to argue against governments supporting these mega deals. But there really is a very strong basis for interregional or even global coordination work or consolidation of campaigns to really try and challenge these mega FTAs on a much broader level.